All right, we're rolling. Okay, so I haven't ever set the palette up on here before. I start with the Pro White, and then I go with Cadmium Lemon. I am not conservative with the amount of paint I put out. I just find my time is the most valuable thing I have, and I hate digging around for paint on my palette. If I don't throw away paint at the end, I did it wrong, basically. I think I mentioned last week when I did this that a lot of people who set up palettes, they don't use a paper towel like I do. This is a professional illustration technique that I learned years ago. They just put it on the palette and let it dry. But re-wetted gouache has a different texture than fresh gouache. I don't like it, so I put out fresh paint every time. Yes, it wastes paint, but like I said, time is the most valuable thing you've got, and the amount of paint it wastes over a semester, you won't use these paints up for the most part while you're here. You'll probably use the permanent yellow depot, have to buy that again. If you got a small tube of the neutral tint, you'll have to buy that again. If you got a big tube like this, you won't. These supplies will pretty much last you through the whole semester, through the whole program. Okay, that's the arrangement. When I set up the paint, I always put a blotting sheet next to it here so I can test my brush strokes out before I go all the way to the paper with them. And here's my brush. It's always useful to have an extra paper towel to wipe and blot as you go. Now, does what I'm working on now look familiar to any of you? These boxes. These two. Yes, no? Did this show up on a video? Okay. Me painting these live did? Okay. I wasn't sure. I hoped I did. I've been in a mess. So I'm going to keep going. Just like with the rounds we did last week. The front view is here, top view is here. Light is coming from this side. So in the case of this peaked piece I have here, light's going to come into here. The brightest light is going to be right along here. The light's going to get cut off by this peak. The darkest shadow is going to be right here. And then the light will pick back up on this side. Does that make sense? And that's how you have to think about these. In this one, I have an elliptical cross section. Light's going to come in from here. Always comes in from the side like this. So this whole area is going to be hit with light. But as it comes around here, it's going to go into shadow. Okay? And so on. I'm going to pick up where I left off, which was on this golden piece here, this yellow metal piece. Just trying to get it centered before I start painting. Okay. The dark color for yellow metal, as I said before, is a mixture of yellow ochre and Van Dyke brown. The main thing is you want it dark enough to stand off well from the ochre, but light enough that you can still go darker for your core shadow color. And I'll come right up against this edge. And put this in. Now this is curving away. If the curve is really fast, the blending lines, I call them, the reflecting lines, will be closer together. If it's softer like this is, there'll be a little bit of a space between them. So something like that. Going back into the white metal, I'll mix some fresh medium tone to do that next cylinder with. When you're working on the vellum, you want to go a little bit lighter than you think you should. It's going to be much more likely that you're too dark than that you're too light. There's a good example of about how dark it would be. Of course, that hasn't dried yet. When it dries, it'll go darker. I do want to outline this. I'm going to take the lazy way out today and use a pencil. Like so. I'm going to come over and work on that first shape. I want my light color. My light color is going to be mostly white with a little bit of neutral tint in it. The way I'm going to tend to mix that is I'm going to come into what I've already got mixed and add white up to the edge of it and pull some of that in until I get a slightly gray color. I don't want my bristles on my brush to disappear completely. If they do, the paint is too heavy. I need to add water. But that's fine. So the light comes in from here. I need to roll that brush a little bit so I get a point. If your brush is making a weird flat shape like that, you go to your blotter and you pull and twirl until you get a better point. So a light area here. And by the way, that little line I have there, I added that when I was painting the dark. As I go back into the light, it may not make sense anymore, and I may paint it out. I'm free to do that. I'm basically trying to capture the form each step as I go. And as I have more values, I need less lines, basically, so I can start painting things back out again. Like so. Where the bumps are, where they're raising up, I may come in with a little crisp edge. And accentuate them. Those accentuating lines will stop where the shadows begin. Like so. Okay? Going back into my yellow piece, I'm going to use permanent yellow deep and white. to make a light yellow. It's got to be bright enough that it stands apart from the yellow ochre, and I want some nice yellow color to it. I don't want it to be too chalky. I want there to be a nice golden yellow quality to it. That brush is a little too loaded. I'm going to add a little bit of water, brush it out to the side so I don't contaminate my main pool, and then come in and kind of pull that in. That's better. The light on here is going to start somewhere in this area. And it's going to fill most of this up. I'm looking for parallel bands here, so I want to be careful as I'm painting that I get that as nice as I reasonably can. This is not CAD, this is hand painted, so absolutely static widths and thicknesses are not only very hard to achieve, but they're not necessarily desirable. And I'll put in a blending line here, which will probably be eradicated in a minute. But in case it isn't, I'll add it. And I need some light to come back into that far side. The light's coming back in over here. So I'm going to pick that up over along this side. Like so. Okay. Now I'm going to knock in that other yellow block over there, the one on the far right. You want to keep these simpler than not. The more complicated they get, actually the harder the form is to read. I did not bring a kneaded eraser to blot out my point with, so it's going to get messy. All right. So I'm going to and then fill that in with yellow ochre straight from the tube. That is our base color for yellow. And I will let that dry. Developing these two cylindrical forms is really about where you place the shadows. On the lower elliptical shaped one, the shadows are going to stay over to the right side. The shadows, you can see, start about here. So I'm not going to start any further over than that with my paint. As I'm painting this in, it looks like it's barely even different in value. But you will see that as it dries, it steps up quite a bit. I'm going to want to have some blending as the light falls away here on the side. So I'll put a reflecting line along here. Done. Coming over to the two humps that we have here, I'm going to go into the full values now with this. I'm going to use straight neutral tint for the core shadow, the darkest shadow. And you want these core shadows to be closer to the light than the dark. So they're going to be more towards the light source. They're in the shaded area, but the portion of the shaded area they occupy is the area closest to the light source. Like that. And you can see that's giving it more of a rounded effect. Coming into the peaked yellow metal piece, I'm going to blend Van Dyke Brown and neutral tint to get a very dark chocolate color. And I'm going to take this right up along the edge. I'm going to use that to really catch the shadow coming off of that peak. Okay. Coming over to the stuck to the table. Coming over to the full round pipe here, I'm going to mix the shade color, which is yellow ochre and burnt sienna again. Burnt Van Dyke Brown, I'm sorry. Paint for too many years, all the names of the paint get jumbled in your head. And since the light coming around here now is going to stop right at about the middle before it goes to shade, that's about where I'm going to start my shade. I'll start it just a little bit to the right of the middle. And I'll let it occupy a fairly fat band here. And then as this falls away rapidly, I'll put in one blending reflection line. In here. And I should add one over here because it's going to fall away on this side as well. Okay. Coming back over to the two humps. The last value left here is pure white. And this is really a challenge, especially if you're working back and forth in color like I am now, because you get some yellow paint on your brush and all of your whites are creamy. You want it to be heavy enough to be really opaque, but really thick white paint makes for a very clunky brush. So it is a challenge to make this work. The highest highlight is about right here. Just on the left side of that dark reflecting line. You have a couple of choices here, guys. You can either go transparent and build it in layers, or you can go heavy and try and control a nice cream cone of a brush. I only recommend the latter if you have a lot of experience. And to show you the other one, I'll do that now, because I do tend to just go thick. I can control the brush. I'm not nervous. But for you guys, I would recommend to take your paint much thinner. Something more like this. Highlight once again is coming up into here. And you can see that's flowing a lot more easily off my brush. Unfortunately, it's also going to dry less white. And when it does, I'm going to have to come back in and redo another layer. Notice how much wider I'm making this. This flat area of light is a lot wider than this little hump right here. So I'm going to let the white spread out in here and get wider. The highlight color on the peaked piece is cadmium lemon and white, mostly white. Remember we discussed last time about the reason I use the cadmium lemon, even though it's a very expensive pigment, is that I can add a lot of white to that and it'll still stay intense. See a couple of things. You can see the color mixture I'm making here. You can also see how I use the white. I pull the yellow off this end and the dark off that end so I don't mess it up. brightest highlight is going to be right along this peak. And backing that right up against that edge is important to getting the effect I want. There's also going to be a fairly wide swath of highlight in here. And that large tray of light coming up. Also want to do an accent along the edge of the piece to show that it has a hard corner. Now to do this properly, I want to leave a little bit of that pencil line on the outside. Otherwise, the piece falls into the paper. And across the top. I will not continue it beyond the peak. To clean up the drawing, even though in realism it probably wouldn't be here, because I'm using vertical strokes, it's nice to come along and clean them up with a horizontal catch right there. I don't want any highlight on this side. I want it to be a definite, in this particular piece, I want a definite light and dark side of the piece. That emphasizes that peak down the middle. Okay? Moving over to the low elliptical cylinder in the white metal. Core shadow, straight neutral tint. Now I didn't get very strong value contrast on this piece between the brown tone and the shade, but I think it's okay because I think I got it too dark on the other. And it's going to be different every time you do it. You're going to acquire an eye for it over time. There will always be variation because you're painting it by hand each and every time. And I'll bring in a reflecting line right up along the edge where it rolls away fast. I don't want it to go right to the corner, but it'll come close. What you'll often see is I stop the stroke and lift. If I'm insecure at all about how it's going, I lift the tool off the paper. Yeah, that's okay. I would like the one to be a little thicker. But not a lot thicker. You have to develop the level of brush control that you can come in and say, okay, I want it a little thicker, I'm going to do it. And you've got to develop an eye for knowing where and why you might want it a little thicker. Okay. Moving on to the full cylinder. I'm going to use the Van Dyke Brown and the neutral tint. Get that nice chocolate color going again. See, there's color mixing, but since you mix the same colors over and over again, you get a sense. It doesn't take you long to do. I want this to be close to this light. I don't want it to go all the way to the corner, though. I don't want this effect. I want there to be a rounding. So I want to leave space for the regular shaded color to stand. Before the core shadow comes in. And that's typical for me. I'll paint the boundary first, and then I'll come in and widen it. And this fairly bold band of dark color, almost right down the middle of a cylinder, is actually what you see in life when you observe metal pipe. You'll often see what looks like a very dark line going boom, right down the middle. That's what it looks like. Okay, going for the highlight colors for these two. Pure white. Now, since the low dome is quite wide, there will be a rather wide area of highlight. We've got highlight coming kind of all the way through here. So I will create that effect up here. I don't want it to come anywhere near the center, though. If I bring that highlight up to the middle, it's going to feel like a full dome. It's really important to me that this feels elliptical. So I really don't want it going any farther over. Than somewhere in that area. I can allow a reflecting line to come in there, and I will. It's a little wider first. And then there'll be a reflecting line somewhere in here to help that blend the way across. Okay. All I have to do with this now is to put a rim along the top edge. There won't be one along the side because it's not crisp. It's not a corner on the side there. It's rounded. But this is a crisp corner. So I will paint it. And like I said, even though it wouldn't happen on the bottom, I'm comfortable cheating and letting it happen on the bottom as well, because it helps clean up the drawing. On the full pipe, cylindrical pipe, once again it's the highlight color, cadmium, lemon, and white. And this highlight is going to run almost down the middle. It'll be somewhere in here. And because this curve is moving quickly, it's not a low open curve, it's tight and round, I will not let it get very wide. something like that. Now I can do a blending line if I want to from this. It's a little risky, because it's looking pretty good the way it is. But I can do it. And if I did it, I would run it closer up to here. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe I run it the other side. Yeah, like that better. Oh, bad brush stroke. Fortunately, it missed the piece. Crisp the edge. By the way, in Opalux, if you paint on the outside of your piece like that, you can take it off with a razor blade. It's the last thing you do, though. Because once you've scraped the paper, you've ruined its texture. You won't be able to paint on it again. But you can basically erase Opalux. Okay. Now, the thing that's missing, particularly on the rounded items, is reflected light. Reflected light is light that bounces back in from the environment. I know we are officially up, but if you can give me a minute, it'll be worth your time. And then you can leave and I will put this all away. You want that light color, not the highlight, but the pretty light color. The white with a little bit of neutral tint in it. And I'm going to come back in right along the edge. And pick that up. Looks very bright right now, but it won't be. It will drop in value. I'm going to do the same thing on the low cylinder. Come into here. And bring some light back around the other side. And can you see how that makes it look more rounded? You can actually feel the light bouncing up around the other side of the piece. The two-humped one is not as effective because it got a little too bright. I'm painting too fast. And then also on the yellow cylinder, same thing, you want that warm yellow with white. And guys, for your homework, I want you to paint an exercise sheet. Okay? I want you to paint one row of yellow, one row of white. One row of yellow, one row of white. In both the discs and the pipes. Okay? If it's not giving you enough oomph, add some bright yellow to it. You can cheat. You really want to feel this light coming in around the back on a circular or highly domed piece. It's important. Okay.